I'd like to introduce John Rogers. Hi, John. As President Zimmer mentioned, John is the co-CEO and Chief Investment Officer for Ariel Investments. He also serves as Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees for the University of Chicago. John sits on several corporate boards, including McDonald's, Nike, I want those, we're going to talk about some sneakers on the side, and the New York Times Company. And an interesting fact about John is that he beat Michael Jordan during the height of Michael Jordan's career in basketball in a one-on-one basketball game. So you didn't know I was going to say that.
Right.
Well, thank you for joining me for the Fireside Chat this evening.
It's great to be here.
And now I am honored to introduce a civil rights icon, the Reverend Al Sharpton. Reverend Sharpton is an internationally renowned civil rights leader and founder and president of the National Action Network, which has more than 100 chapters across the country. Reverend Sharpton is the host of Politics Nation on MSNBC and a nationally syndicated radio show called Keeping It Real, as well as a nationally broadcast radio show on Sundays titled The Hour of Power. Reverend Sharpton is a disciple of the teachings of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He has been at the forefront of the modern civil rights movement for nearly half a century. In 2004, Reverend Sharpton's presidential run brought thousands of new voters into the electoral process. He has championed police reform and accountability. He has fought for voting rights, a living wage, equality in education, health care, and LGBTQ rights, and so much more. Joining us now is Reverend Al Sharpton.
Well, thank you. Very honored to be with you tonight, Nadia, and certainly honored to be with John Rogers, who I've worked with and known down through the years. And I can say in my younger days, I had tremendous support from the Godfather, Soul James Brown, so I'm happy to be with another Godfather tonight, John Rogers.
Well, thank you, Reverend. So happy that you're here this evening. We just really appreciate it.
So let's jump into this. I wanted to begin our discussion around the asset management industry. I want to provide just a little background for some of our viewers. The asset management is a $69 trillion industry. However, minority women-owned firms only manage 1.3% of these assets. University endowments represent over $600 billion in assets, and more than half of those funds are held by the 30 largest endowments. President Zimmer mentioned our University of Chicago endowment and how we've invested with 24 minority and women-owned asset management firms. But Reverend Al, you have written letters to several universities regarding the underrepresentation of minority and women-owned asset management firms. And you've called on them to disclose their hiring of African-American managers as well. Why do you think endowments are so reluctant to hire minority and women-owned asset management firms?
Well, in our judgment and working in this area with National Action Network, the resistance of these endowments opening up to asset managers that are minority owned, or even those that are minority in majority firms, has been a glaring contradiction to the reputation many of them have as being very liberal and inclusive institutions. It seems to us that, and we approach this as a civil rights issue, that you can't advocate progressive ideas and do business in a regressive manner. When you look at the data that we've been able to ascertain just from public records, and which is why we asked to have them give us their own records if they are any different. It is absolutely the opposite of their projected images. You can't advocate progressive politics, progressive policies, and become the bastion of American liberalism, but you do business like we're still in the era of Jim Crow. So many of these endowment firms hold endowments, rather, in colleges and universities, have billions of dollars in endowment, but do pennies, if any, with asset management firms that are handled by blacks, handled by other minorities, and in any way handled by minorities that are in majority firms. That's a glaring contradiction. Many of them, by the way, are institutions that enjoy public funds and public access. And
Right.
yet, the majority of those cities and states that they operate in, you have a significant percentage of minorities in them. So therefore, taxpayers are subsidizing them, but they're not investing in our firms,
Right.
and that becomes important. And that is why we look at it as a civil rights issue and we're pursuing it. Why they will not expand, we want to know, because there's no logical reason. You have many minority asset firms that can produce and deliver and secure the investment and make a profit for them, matching any firm they're doing business, and in many cases have done better with the
Right.
investments and not given the opportunity.
Right. Right. That's true. In fact, a lot of minority-owned asset management firms actually have been seen to outperform some of their, white male-owned peers. Right.
Nadia, I would add too, and I've talked to Reverend Al about this, so many times universities and hospitals and museums, they focus on supplier diversity and they think about construction, catering, and janitorial services, which are important businesses. But it is a modern day Jim Crow if the black and brown people only get the opportunities in the lowest margin segments of the supplier diversity chain and don't have a chance to do money management, legal services, advertising services, public relations firms. And I think it is this implicit unconscious bias. They see us working with our hands, they can't see us working with our minds. And that's what's been so great about your leadership, Nadia, and President Zimmer's leadership, to have the University of Chicago stake out a completely different perspective around this and realize we have more than the capability and the talent to do all the professional services, all the financial services, and be able to make a difference for our university and our city and our nation. But again, the systemic racism that's still out there in so much of the nonprofit communities has been so damaging for all of us as we try to build wealth in our own communities.
Reverend Sharpton, how do you feel about some of the responses that you've gotten back, or have you gotten back responses?
We've gotten various excuses, but not the data that we've asked for, and it's sort of more like trying to rationalize exclusion rather than be open, like the University of Chicago, I think, has set an example in what it's done, listening to President Zimmer, listening to your head of procurement. This should be the model. And I'll give you another irony. We have at the same time simultaneously called on unions, for example, to give us reports on who does the asset management for their pension funds. And many of them are just as bad or almost as bad as some of the universities and colleges. And when you look at what happens to the funds that are invested, they in many cases will invest with developers, for example.
Oh, I think he's frozen.
The
Did we
people
lose?
from where they're living. So in many ways, grandma is removed from her house in the name of gentrification. They are zoned out, or there's deals made, and grandma has no idea that her pensions is financing her removal. So in many ways, we are the ones paying for our own removal. We're paying for gentrification
Wow.
while we question it.
Wow. So it's interesting that you talk about some of the excuses, because I've read a lot of the articles that have been coming up as a result of your letters, and I have seen a lot of excuses. And they're either excuses, or they're saying, we're gonna create a diversity council, and we're gonna create, pipeline programs. And then you also see them redefining what constitutes doing business, right, with a minority-owned business, which is a business that's 51% owned and operated. And so now they're, redefining what that is. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well,
Yeah,
I think that is,
when,
yeah.
I think that just let me say this, John. I think that anytime we hear them redefining, that is to try to move the goal line a little further so we can't reach it. And I was taught coming up in the movement that those that define you can confine you, and I think that we cannot let them change the definition. Uh, Let us compete under the same given rules that you do business, and show that we can deliver and outperform those that you're dealing with. But we see more of a defense and a roadblock than we
Yeah,
see a highway toward an inclusive of society that all of us claim that we want to have.
yeah.
Well, I would just add too that because of your leadership, Reverend Sharpton, and also Congressman Cleaver and Congressman Kennedy sent out letters to many, many universities around the country, and the data would have been really horrific, except that these guys decided to change their definition of what a minority firm was, so the data wouldn't look so bad. And it's kind of heartbreaking if you think about it. The chief investment officers of some of these organizations that have kept us out for 40 years are now redefining what it means to be a minority business to make it have a lower hurdle to jump over for themselves. So when they report to their boards of trustees of how progressive they are, they've been able to redefine things in a way that is totally unfair and will really not build wealth and opportunity in the black community if we allow them to do this. So it's so important that you've shined a spotlight on this crucial issue, and we can't let them change the rules in the middle of the game. And the idea is that you're going to be able to have firms that are really majority owned, and then have a minority partner somewhere be allowed to be a minority owned business. It really, again, really hurts our ability to build strong African American companies that can create multi-generational wealth and opportunity and multi-generational philanthropy for our communities.
And just speaking about, building wealth, I went through and I wanted to, the university has met with over 100 minority women-owned asset management firms over the past 12 years. And so I went through and I did a list of all those firms, and I wanted to give it back to the endowment so that we can just look over, let's look over this list of firms and see kind of, where we are now. And it was amazing. It was actually horrific to see the number of firms from when I started this program to now that no longer exist. And what did I say? It's a $69 trillion industry, a $69 trillion industry. Minority businesses should not be going out of business and just to see that number. And I think, part of it goes to the fact that, institutions, foundations, museums are not hiring minority asset management firms.
Well, the
And
question I would
when you
ask,
look at that, they're not going out of business because they couldn't do business. They're going out
Right.
of business because they couldn't get business. They
They couldn't
couldn't
get
get
business.
what they needed to operate. And again, when you're looking at museums, when you're looking at foundations, when you're looking at universities and colleges, all of them all get some kind of engagement to do business from these municipalities. So one of the things National Action Network has said is it must also be a political issue. We have raised it with mayors and city councilmen or board of aldermen, even up now to the presidential level, that this must be part of the issues you run on. Where is your economic empowerment plan for our communities? So we're not just talking about giving grants to people or doing things that, as John says, that help us to train them to use their hands and cut us out of the business of where we can develop enough revenue and enough wealth that we can help lift our communities up. The right wing talks all the time about lift yourself up from with your bootstraps, but you
Straps.
can't lift yourself up with your bootstraps if you don't have boots.
Well, Reverend Al, I've got maybe two questions for you. As you know, you've kept this fight alive for a long time. Reverend Jackson has, Mark Morial has. The civil rights leaders have done their part more and more. But when you talk about political empowerment, we don't have the kind of political leadership that we had when we had Maynard Jackson as the mayor of Atlanta, Harold Washington here in Chicago. Why don't we have a generation of political leaders willing to fight for economic justice? I know Maxine Waters is, Joyce Beatty is, but they're relatively rare. Why is that today?
I think a lot of it is that a lot of our political leaders, including some of the younger crowd that is coming in, do not understand the business side and do not understand that unless we are economically empowered, we are not politically going to be able to sustain the offices that we're in. There was a time that you would see like the mayor of every major city, black or brown. I remember when the mayor of LA, mayor of Chicago, mayor of Atlanta, mayor of New York, mayor of Philadelphia, mayor of Atlanta, all were black at the same time. Now you might have had out of all of them maybe two. Why is that? Because you have to go to the business community to get your financial backing, your contributors to your campaign. So it's not even in their own self-interest. And in the name of progressivism, they end up going into, well, we're not going to deal with finance. We're anti, quote, Wall Street, whatever that's supposed to mean, rather than saying, no, we need to have a progressive agenda of racial inclusion where people can go into business and deal with delivering, performing, and they are those that are rooted and grounded in the communities that we claim we're progressive about. That's what I call latte liberals, where they can talk well, sit up at Starbucks somewhere and drink expensive lattes and philosophize about the social order, leaving out the financial services and the financial behavior of those in the cities or states or whatever domain that they are elected to represent.
Right.
Well, do you think it will ultimately take, we need to get more progressive political leaders who are going to fight for economic justice. Dr. King talked how important economic justice was for our community. But will it take boycotts of some of these museums and institutions that are not working with black firms? Is that what it'll take in this 21st century to bring the kind of change that we deserve and the opportunities we deserve?
I think it will take boycotts and I think it will take public demonstrations. The idea of demonstrating and marching, which many that are viewing this know that I do in areas of policing and other areas, I think that it is just as important that we put the spotlight using marches. Marches don't solve problems, it exposes them. I think we've got to really put some exposure methods on them because people in these cities would be outraged if they knew the kind of exclusionary practices that they were being subjected to.
Thanks so much for that. That's just absolutely brilliant, and I'm so glad to hear you, talking that way. We've got to shine a spotlight, continue to shine a spotlight on this problem, because it's changing slowly but surely. And as you said, the University of Chicago is a model of how to do this well. We need more and more models in this world. And the Knight Foundation in Miami, there's several others that are doing well, but there's still too few.
But John,
And the
even
fact
in
that they are so reluctant, the fact that these institutions, these museums, these universities and all are so reluctant to even give the data or then try to redefine what minority is, shows the guilt and shows that they are not really as progressive as they say. Otherwise, they would say, let's come to the table and work on this. If you were really progressive or if you were really pro America becoming the inclusive society, the beloved community that Dr. King talked about, you'd say, all right, we are very much needed in this area to make change. Let's sit down and figure out how we do that rather than send letters trying to justify what is clearly unjustifiable.
Sometimes I think honesty just helps. When I first started talking to the university about professional services, and I was having, just a lot of sit-down conversations, and I remember talking to the endowment team, and at the time we didn't have a lot of diverse firms. We didn't have any black money management firms, and it was just an honest conversation. They said, "Look, you know what? We don't have any." And I said, well, I'm going to take the time and I will help you look for some. I will do the due diligence and I will help look for them, and then I'll bring them in. And I don't understand why. It's just that simple. Just be honest and say, you know what, we've never looked. We haven't looked. And yes, now we're going to take the time and we're going to meet and we're going to look at some of these firms.
But the other reason that it's hard to talk about ourselves, but I think part of the reason we've been a model is because your leadership, Nadia, has been so strong and persistent. You've been in there fighting the good fight. And then when you have the president of the university who grew up in New York City in the diverse community, who believes
Right.
deeply in diverse perspectives and points of view and equal opportunity for everyone, that creates the kind of energy that allows this kind of change to happen. And then Mark Schmidt has done a great job as CIO, but of course many, many other departments throughout the university have also. So that's what we have to try to show people, how to do this. I think we want the University of Chicago to be that role model and be able to inspire other institutions to do what we've been able to do here.
But it does take leadership, and it takes people on boards. You speak up on all of the boards that you're on. We have conversations about that. It takes the people who are on the boards of these museums to speak up and talk about what it is they're not doing. I think we need more people on boards to start doing that, to speaking up.
Well, the only reason they are on the board is to try and help to add to what the institution is about. And they should speak up because that's the reason they're there. Otherwise, why would we be proud of people being on boards
Right.
to give color to the same kind of situations and the same kind of arrangements? And it goes to what you said, Nadia, having the will to do it. How many of these institutions call somebody like Mark Smith and say, how did y'all do it? If you had the will, you would look at University of Chicago and say, let me learn what you did to be able to do what we have not been able
Right.
to do. But you have to have the will to do it, which
Right.
is why
Right.
activist groups like us have to come in and give them the offer that they can't refuse, that you can do this or you can do that, but you can't do this and that. You cannot operate in the public space with public tax abatements and public municipal tax exemptions, and yet the public is not given a fair share of anything other than labor at a level that we would have in the Jim Crow era. And we're still in the Jim Crow era when it comes to asset management in many firms and institutions around this country.
So I want to, we do have Reverend Sharpton here, so I want to talk a little about politics. President-elect Biden has started to fill his economic post. Bloomberg came out with an article, I think it was over the weekend, and one of the areas of it mentioned that one of the areas of focus for Biden administration is to be on small business lending. And so while, access to capital is important for our small businesses, I'm wondering how can we influence the expansion of this focus on business lending to also access to clients and opportunities? How can we develop a discussion around the importance of hiring diverse businesses and not just giving them loans? So what are your thoughts on that?
I feel that those of us that we feel that have access to Vice President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris need to make this a real issue and say that we're not just talking about loans, we're talking about investment, and they need to do it with federal agencies. If you look at the government
Right,
itself,
right.
which is why a lot of the
Yeah.
as John talked about, Congresswoman Waters and Kennedy and others, they must raise this in the legislative halls, and we need to have an audit on what the federal agencies, federal government itself is doing in terms of business with people. Not just give us a loan, give us business because we're qualified to handle it.
Right.
And there are many firms that can show that they have done that. They've taken the investment and their clients have increased in the return. So what is the problem other than not having the will and the initiative to go forward?
I would just say that's critically important. As we know, we've had entrepreneurs come and speak at this conference every year, Reverend Al, who talked about the fact that when they had a great client like the University of Chicago, not only did the revenue that was generated make a difference, like our friend Melody Spann Cooper at WVON, but then they could use the fact that they had an anchor client like the University of Chicago and leverage that to get other clients, other nonprofits to work with them for the first time. So having that access to being a customer is so important. You know, McDonald's has done that over generations with black franchisees and black suppliers. Exelon has done that very well here in Chicago. We need to continue to remind people how important it is to have these anchor clients. And I know so many of the people who come and visit the university understand that. And it's just something that we just can't let people off the hook by giving us a micro loan. And those same institutions continue to do all their business with the same all-white male firms they always have.
And you know, you mentioned the federal government. A while back, we received, several months ago, we received a letter. And so I know that they were trying to ask educational institutions and other entities about what our spend was. And so, you know, because we get government, we have some grants, they included the university in that. But I will tell you, and you know, maybe this is something else that the new administration can work on. They had no clue about what they were asking in terms of spend and how they were asking us about the spend. So they got all these different answers. Then they came back and asked and re-asked the questions, and nothing ever came out of it. So I really do think that, you know, there's a lot of work to be done in even asking the questions on what government entities and how they're spending their dollars and what they're spending their dollars on and how they're spending their dollars.
Yeah, but I would just add quickly, if you think
Absolutely.
about, yeah, oh, sorry, Reverend.
Go
The
ahead,
other thing
John.
on quickly on that, on federal government, not only they have direct control over things like the PBGC and the National Railroad Trust and of course the Federal Thrift, they also have indirect control of the Smithsonian and the Kennedy Center and many institutions like that that have large asset pools.
And when you look at the fact, like John mentions Congresswoman Beatty, who's the incoming chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, one of the things that we're urging is that they start having public hearings and bring in cabinet members to talk about their departments that they're over as they come in now. We just saw this election. We have a new administration come in. We need to challenge them in public hearings to look at these kinds of ways that their agencies are doing business. Like he mentioned, railroad. It's astronomical money, but they're not working with our business entities. And if you put pressure on them, we're dealing right now in the middle of a pandemic, and some of us, even under the Trump administration, was pushing Mnuchin. Mnuchin would give some loans, many of which did not reach a lot of our businesses, but they never talk about doing business. So the one consistent thing we see, whether we have right wing or left wing people in office, is both wings don't fly with doing business with our asset managers and with our business people. So there's really no fundamental business difference. We need to change that. And I think as we are on the precipice of changing this administration to a new one, is an opportune time to penetrate and make that a central issue of a new era. And especially as we're talking about recovering and doing what we can to sustain business after the pandemic, We need to rearrange how we do business, period, from top to bottom.
Right.
Yes, we need to save small businesses, but we also need to do business with those stable businesses that are doing a little more in terms of revenue, but they're not getting anywhere near what they should in terms of their ability to perform.
I would just say that that's a great point. And one of the things you think about, the new transportation secretary could put pressure on Delta and United and American Airlines to work with black businesses in everything that we do, the major railroad chains. The same thing, the new Department of Defense secretary could be pushing the big defense contractors to work with black-owned businesses in all the professional services and things that we do. You go down the list, I think that's a really important point you're making, Reverend.
Absolutely.
And I think it's getting them to hire professional service firms, because I think they will do business with the catering companies and like you say,
the distribution companies where you have really low margins, it's
low
basically
margins.
pass-through contracts.
Right.
And again, they know if they build a new building, they have to have a construction firm, which is important. I'm glad the Smithsonian, had the Russell family build that building. It was the right thing to do. It was great. But they still should also be spending their professional services and financial services dollars with black firms too.
Absolutely.
John,
and then a Russell firm, if they do, a Russell firm has stable and growing financial institutions in our community that they can go to if they need to go to them. Everyone says do for yourself, but how can you do for yourself if everyone's getting use out of your tax dollars and consumer dollars but you? There's a lot we can do for ourselves if our monies was recycled in our communities, and if those that are brightest among us in the financial area are given the opportunity, they can reinvest and help to build our community. But if you have everything going out, nothing coming in, and they only give you certain level of contracts, then you're just recycling the same kind of financial problem and despair that you claim that you want to try to alleviate.
Right, that's right. John, you always talk about the difference between business diversity, using the terminology, business diversity and supplier diversity. And can you talk a little about why terminology is important for this work?
Well, as you know, you coined the term business diversity, and we're using it everywhere, and we're getting many institutions to use it. And the problem is that when you get a progressive CEO now for the first time in this, horrendous George Floyd heartbreaking moment to think about working with minority business, they go and talk to someone, they're told to do supplier diversity, which again, as I said earlier, is the lowest margin, least wealth building part of their spend. And no one tells them that they can use a black accounting firm or advertising agency or public relations firm, 401k money manager, whatever it happens to be. And so terminology matters. We got to get away from this outdated terminology. Our economy has moved to a professional services, financial services, and technology-based economy, from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. And we just cannot be using this term that's literally like Blockbuster Video versus Netflix. It's that out of date as our economy has evolved and moved. So we just have to keep pushing that. I'm so much applaud you for coming up with that term, business diversity, because it's really helped to shape the way people think about this problem.
And it really is about the business of, the corporation or the educational institution. The way that you are going to become a more successful business is by adding more, diversity and inclusion and more diverse viewpoints. You had mentioned, you had a quote in one of your letters, and you had mentioned, oh gosh, what did you say? Oh, you said if you weren't working with the best and failed to track or report with whom you are working with, how do you know that you are in fact maximizing performance? And that goes to the same thing with businesses. How do you know that you're getting the best businesses to help your company grow if you're not looking to minority and women-owned businesses, right? And so I think the whole idea of business diversity is looking at it's a broader picture. It's looking at it from a different level rather than just your procurement level.
and it helps your business. If you have a wider span of people that you have competing, and we have businesses, asset managers businesses, and others that are in the black community or that are black owned or brown owned or women owned, and they can outperform, you are being negligent to your own institution not to do business with them.
Right.
We could play baseball before Jackie Robinson went to the majors. Once blacks were put in the majors, the game became bigger and better. Michael Jordan,
Right.
because of the color line was broke down in basketball, they didn't know John Rogers could beat Michael in a game. Nobody else could. So you don't know the talent that's there, and that talent helps
Right.
the
That's right.
business. So it's not only non-inclusive, it is nonsensical for the business that you could be reaping more profit and more return on your own business deals.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. That's right. That's right. I want to talk a little about the impact of alumni on their alma maters. John, we have talked about this, about alumni of color and the impact that they can have. How do we get more of our alums of color to start talking about these issues and asking, their former, asking their alma maters, what are they doing in terms of hiring diverse businesses?
Well, I think all of us, we've all gone to different universities. I've spent a lot of time talking to the leadership of the Black Alumni Association of Princeton, for example, about pushing Princeton to be more progressive and frankly follow in the footsteps of the University of Chicago. I think we can all do that. We can all work with our alma maters as alums to point out this problem and say that we're glad that the university has more minority students, more minority professors, but we want to make sure that our graduates have successful careers. People have sacrificed so much. Families, black women have sacrificed so much to get their kids into these institutions, and these kids deserve to have a fair shot at an extraordinarily successful career, because we know our black and brown graduates have great skills, great talents, great leadership skills. And so it's just so important that we remind these universities that it's just not about getting us into the school, but also working with us as we graduate so we can have economic opportunities to really fully participate in our capitalist democracy based upon our extraordinary gifts and skills that we bring to the party.
And I think the other thing is our alums come to me and they do have an expectation that, they can get an opportunity with the University of Chicago. And I think it's interesting when I talk to a lot of black businesses and they say that, I can go to this great institution and I can pay, all this money and they can educate me. But when I graduate and I become an entrepreneur, they don't want to work with me. And I just find that so, so interesting, but it really is, it goes to a lot of the things that you were saying, Reverend Al.
It is not only interesting, Nadia, it's insulting. And they
It's
want
insulting, right?
alums to be proud that they went to these institutions. But if
Yeah.
you can't do business or can't get positions that would advance where you were in the area that you were educated toward, then what does it mean? So we have a movement where we want to remove the names of Confederates or racists from the institutions, but we need to even go in the institutions and change how they do business. So to take down a Confederate general, but to leave a segregated way of doing business is not to complete the task. Take down the Confederate policies in terms of your procurement, in terms of your financial arrangements, in terms of your investments, in terms of who manages your money. Don't just give us symbolism, give us a substantive way that we do business. And alums would be even prouder to say that they go to that place.
I really do think that this needs to be a broader national conversation, in particular talking about educational institutions, because one of the things that I've noticed is that in corporate America, they have been focusing on diversity of their contracts for years. And a lot of that has to do with pressure from their clients. Universities have really, I would say, kind of gotten off the hook over the years. There hasn't
Yeah.
been, a lot of focus on educational institutions, and even the, business organizations don't focus on them a lot. And I think it's because people probably don't understand how much of an economic engine educational institutions are. And so they've gotten away over the years because the lens hasn't been on them with not doing much. And so I think, now is the time. Now is the time to really start putting, more of a focus on how these educational institutions are engaging minority businesses beyond, asset management.
I think you're right. I think that institutions, especially universities and colleges, cannot just give great analysis of the class struggle and great analysis of the politics of the day and not deal
Yeah.
with their own internal way of doing business. You mentioned the painful George Floyd era that we've just that we're still in and that we've gone through. Well, one of the things that I'm saying is that it's not enough for major corporations to, in a moment of Black Lives Matter movement that we've all been involved in and in the forefront of, to just throw money at charities
Yes.
and not
Right.
do business with us. So what happens next summer? If there's not a George Floyd, they're not going to be throwing the money at charities, and they're going to do business as usual. We must change the way they do business, and we would be able to take care of our own charities.
Right.
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 Exactly.
Right.
And I would just say one thing last, you talk about alums. The other thing we can ask for too is as people are getting appointed to these trustee boards, we want to have trustees that are willing to speak out and fight for us once they're in the boardrooms, both black and white leaders. And too often you'll see many companies and many universities and hospitals and museums have chairmen of the boards who are often maybe white males, sometimes white females, who have not shown a history of concern about working with black companies or having black executives in their leadership ranks. And then they take over the chairmanship of these large institutions. And it's not a surprise then that those institutions are not living the values that they say they care about. Because they've appointed leaders who have not showed that they've shared those values in their business careers as they've developed. So I think that's the next chapter. We've got to make sure we have progressive leaders on these boards. They're going to fight for social and economic justice to create equal opportunities for all of us.
Well, they're not asking them, right? They're not asking them, what are your values? Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a board trustee, but I don't know that, anyone is asking what are your values, in diversity and inclusion, right?
Well, as you know, as you're co-chair
And what
of the...
is your history? What is your background?
Right.
What is your track record in that?
Yeah, right.
Exactly, Reverend Al. And I was just going to give Nadia a shout out too. She serves on the Barack Obama Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Obama Foundation, here in Jackson Park. And that's one of the things the Obama Foundation is working hard on now, making sure as they bring new trustees on, that they're people who share the values that the president had and Michelle had. And that's kind of it's an important conversation, and it's the way that institution can role model the appropriate leadership we want to see in other nonprofits throughout the nation.
Right. So I want to talk about your book because I had an experience with this book, Reverend Sharpton. So the title of your book, here it is Rise Up, Confronting a Country at the Crossroads. And so even though, we now have a new president-elect and, everybody's, more than half the country's feeling good about what's going on, we're still facing two pandemics. We have COVID-19, we have racism and discrimination. Black and Latino communities are still dying from COVID-19. And you talk a lot in this book about these issues and more. And one of the things that I liked about reading the book was that it's almost like it's all these stories. Like you're telling like all these stories about, from back in the day and, up until now and how you've been, fighting the good fight. And as I was reading it, I actually felt the Lord give me a word. And I am telling you, I called my event planner, Twyla Jenkins, because I said, I've been reading Al's book, and I just feel like I got a word about growing weary. Because, you have just done so much. And I was like, I just have a word about growing weary. And so I said, I got to turn to the Bible. I got to turn to the Bible. So I turned to the Bible, Reverend Al. I'm thinking about you and Reverend Jesse Jackson and Representative Lewis and the letter he left after his death. And I was just like, how have they not grown weary? And so I turned to Galatians 6:9, because that's what the Lord led me to do. And it says, let us not be weary in well doing, for in due season we shall reap if we not faint. And that has been on my spirit the whole time I read your book. And so my final questions to you are, how have you not grown weary? And how can we remain hopeful? And how do we rise up?
Well, I've not grown weary. It's ironic that you quoted that scripture, because that's one of the scriptures that keep me going. But Nadia and John, Mark Twain said something that I quote all the time. He said, the two most important moments in your life is the moment you're born and the moment you find out why you were born. And I think many of us live life never asking ourselves why we're here. You look at the world we live in. You look at the solar system we're in, and we just saw SpaceX go up. You never saw the sun and the moon collide. You never saw the planets collide. Everything works in perfect order. We know what nature does. We know grass grows. We know that if you plant a seed, it'll grow into a tree. Everything is in order. So why do you or I think that God, out of all these thousands of years, got to us to make his first mistake? We're not a mistake. We're here for a reason. We're here to serve a purpose. And as one, and I shared that in the book, I preached many great people's funerals. I preached James Brown's funeral, Michael Jackson, spoke at Aretha, spoke at Rosa Parks. And what I've stopped doing is preaching the funerals of people that never did anything other than something for themselves, because nobody cares. If you accumulate just material things but don't have a purpose bigger than you, when you go, it won't matter to anybody but you. So I get up every morning and I have this thing where I get up and do my devotional, then I go work out, because I believe that God gave me life to serve a purpose. And my purpose has been to fight social justice, including what we're talking about in this financial area. And I would hope everyone watching us find your purpose in life, and you won't get weary, because that's what your life is about. It is not a burden to work in what you're fulfilling, your calling and your purpose, and the reason God put you here. Because you could have not come here. You could have not been born. You're here for a reason. If you lock into that reason, you will find energy and you will find a reason to keep going, even against adversity. Lastly, those ahead of us had to go through much more than we did. If they could do it, what excuse do we have? We had a huge march in Washington this past summer, August 28th. Over 200,000 people came in a pandemic, and we took their temperatures and we had all of the protocols, which is why you never heard there was a uptick in COVID-19 and there was no violence. And people were saying to me as we were organizing, this is gruesome work. This is hard work. I said, think about 57 years ago when Dr. King and Roy Wilkins and others brought that march to Washington in 63. They had to come from the South in the back of buses. They had to come and couldn't stop on the road to use a public toilet, because most of the restaurants and public toilet facilities were segregated. They had to come with greasy paper bags with fried chicken sandwiches because they couldn't stop and eat at a restaurant on the road. But they came anyway. Because they came, we're flying first class to Washington to do our march for George Floyd. We're staying in the hotels of our choice. If they had given up, we wouldn't be where we are. In 55 years, we went from people in the South that were our color, not being able to vote, to coming to electing and re-electing a black president because they never got weary. We don't have the right to think about getting tired. We can take a nap, get up, and keep working because we come from people that never gave up, that worked through their weariness because they had the strength and belief. If they stood up, if they made one step, as they say in church, God would help make us make two. And that is our destiny if we just grab it, claim it, and go forward. And that's why we're going to change how they do financial services in this country. The last thing Dr. King dealt with was dealing with the economic issue, saying that we fought for people to be able to go and get a cup of coffee. Now we got to be able to make sure that they can afford the cup of coffee. They can stay in a hotel, but can they pay for the room? And that is the mission that we've not stopped. Reverend Jackson picked that up. We're picking that up and continue that after Reverend Jackson, because unless we break this economic frontier, we will always be people that are asking others rather than being able to do for ourselves. And we're not asking or begging here. We're saying these contracts and these arrangements are due us, given our population, given our paying taxes, given our being consumers. Give us the same access any other taxpayers and any other people in the populace have, because we have people who can use their minds, quoting George Rogers, as well as they can use their hands as you do in other communities. That's all we're asking for, and we will settle for nothing less.
Well, that was a word. Thank you, Reverend Al.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for,
Thank you.
For joining me this evening. This meant, it meant so much to me. And thank you, John, as well. Reverend Al, I want to show you my appreciation for your time and your work. So on behalf of the University of Chicago Office of Business Diversity, I would like to donate $10,000 to the National Action Network to help you guys continue your work to promote justice, decency, and equal opportunity for all people.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you, and God bless you and what you have done. I have looked into what you've done, and John has told me, and believe me, you are a hero for all of us. You stay strong and you keep doing the work.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And
Reverend
God,
Al.
Father, I'll see you on the battlefield.
Okay. And thanks so much. You're a role model and an inspiration.